Want to be outside. No, not gonna do it. Nope. Have a seat. Nope, shoot up front. Have a seat.
Welcome, folks. I think we're just out at 12 o'clock. I know some of us have to rush back for lunch hour, but just want to welcome you and thank you all for coming today. Katie has quite the presentation in store. It's quite an honor to welcome back our Katie. Just a couple quick announcements before we dig into the program. I would like to just put on your radar, we have a class coming up by Janet Rose, a writing class that you can sign up for. So there's some flyers in the foyer if you'd like to grab that. I would like you to try to notice our awesome young artist out by the front window, May Gordon, inspired by her rocks. Her paintings are inspired by her rocks. They're so cool. So keep spreading the word about that. We've had lots of students enter, so every month there's a new young artist. Next month, our Lunch and Learn will feature our museum panel, and some of our museum directors are here today. I see Shannon, I saw the Ocean Museum back there, Mackenzie, there we go. So you guys will get to hear from our awesome museum directors next month. Martha has a clipboard and a sign-up for, do you want to explain that show?
Yeah, Dick Bixler and Amy Clarkson have an exhibit at Christ Cathedral in Salina, Kansas. There is going to be a bus actually going up there, and that's been put together by Karen Lemon. And there's 14 people that can sign up. They'll be leaving at 9. It's free and lunch will be provided. So it's a great opportunity if you just don't want to make the drive, if you want to go with someone else. So we'll have a clipboard in the foyer area where you can sign up. So it's for 14 people and it's completely free.
Perfect. Thank you. So see Martha on your way out.
Yep.
Perfect. So we were realizing this morning that all
What was the date on the invitation?
it opens tonight and
It
then
opens
it
tonight and
goes
then,
through the 18th of April.
yeah, and there's a date on which,
It's
did
the
you,
20th,
Clipboard.
the
the
20th.
20th of March, yeah.
20th of March. Sorry about that. That's good information to have.
Such a calendar, right? I mean, you just can't live without your calendar these days. So, well, I know that Gracie has had a lot of fun working with Katie to organize the class tomorrow for second Saturday. We're so thankful and honored that you're teaching that class tomorrow and your skills are being shared. We were realizing this morning, all of us were talking amongst the staff, all of the Buhler family have been featured in those classes and Lunch and Learn. So we have lived off their talent and their expertise. So boy, what a wonderful family you all are. I do remember, I think it was maybe 8 or 9 years ago, the first time I met you. You were performing at a Legacy Arts Society event, Rose Buellman's class, I think. It was you and Emma, and you did a duet, and I was just flabbergasted. And I thought, this is a high school student, and that was back then. So it's just been so fun to watch your career flourish and see what you do. You're a huge asset to our community, and we're so honored to welcome you back. I do want to read your biography, and then I'll turn the floor over to you. I know you'll detail your career and everything you're working on. Katie is an alumna of PHS and the Pratt County 4-H program. She's currently pursuing her master's degree in curriculum and instruction with a focus on learning skills and school improvement at K-State. She serves as the graduate assistant for the K-State Strengths Initiative. So it's based at the Staley School of Leadership, where she coordinates the K-State Strengths Peer Coaching Program. She facilitates workshops to enhance student engagement and well-being. And she designs professional development for undergraduate strengths peer coaches. Katie holds a bachelor's degree in elementary education from K-State and with minors in children's literature and nonprofit leadership studies. She taught 4th grade for 3 years in Wamego. And when she isn't in the classroom or connecting with students, Katie enjoys learning about new sewing, quilting, and fiber arts techniques. And she recently concluded her term as the 2024 National Make It With Wool Senior Ambassador. It's an honor to welcome our Katie back.
Well, Brittany has so generously welcomed me into this space, and I'm so grateful for all of you as part of kind of my community support system from Pratt to welcome me back to share a little bit more about my fiber arts journey and the many ways that I've developed and grown and learned as a fiber artist throughout my life. I've got many mentors and teachers in this room from different capacities, so I first want to just say a huge thank you to all of you for encouraging me, for welcoming me in to learn and discover from you. And I'll give some more shout outs throughout my presentation today. But that's what I'm really here for, is to orient and just tell you more about my fiber arts journey and how I love creating with wool. So Brittany shared a little bit about my background and who I am, but just to kind of give you an overview, after I graduated from Pratt High School, I headed up to Manhattan where I got my undergrad degree at K-State in elementary education. I moved 15 miles down the road in 2020 to teach 4th grade and loved my 3 years getting to spend all day, every day with a bunch of 10-year-olds that brought so much enthusiasm to the classroom space every day. So that was kind of where I began my career. And after being in the classroom for a few years, I decided that I wanted to go ahead and head back to K-State as a full-time student to pursue my master's degree in curriculum and instruction. And last week, I actually just successfully defended my master's portfolio, and I'm on track to graduate in May. So I'll be graduating in May and I'm beginning the job hunt to see where my next steps in education will be, whether that's K-12 or higher education, because as I've continued my education journey, I also got the opportunity to serve as the K-State Strengths Graduate Assistant. And a lot of people hear that and say, were you working with like athletics? Were you doing exercise stuff? If you have noticed my body build, that is not generally quite my avenue of passion. And so, no, K-State Strengths uses the Clifton Strengths Assessment, which is similar to like a Myers-Briggs or an Enneagram personality assessment to help students identify their top 5 strengths. And then I get to work with 12 outstanding strengths peer coaches who are undergraduate students at K-State who sit down and have one-on-one conversations with any student who's taken their strengths assessment to help them apply those strengths in order to achieve academic and career success. So I get to do a lot of the coordination and training of these student coaches. If any of you know Erin Jackson or the Jackson family, she's one of the strengths peer coaches, so it's been a blast getting to continue my relationship with her as 2 fellow Pratt folks. And getting to just continue to mentor those students has been an asset. I've also had the opportunity over the past year to teach the Introduction to Leadership Concepts course at K-State, which is the first course in the leadership minor that we have, and so that has been a new way to kind of expand my capacity to experience teaching at the collegiate level rather than with 10-year-olds. And I'd say there are many differences in those realms, and there's also very many similarities in working in that space too. So it's been a joy to think about how I develop my teaching persona in both areas. To give you a little bit more background now on my fiber arts journey, because that's what I'm here to share with you today. My love of fiber arts actually began before I knew what fiber arts was. My mom had me helping pick out fabric for my very first quilt. I think when I was about a year old. We've got pictures of me touching and feeling the beautiful floral fabrics that my first bedspread was made out of. And then I was behind a sewing machine before I could actually even reach the foot pedal. So I began learning sewing techniques at a very early age. But my journey with wool, which is my kind of fiber of choice, if you would say, began when I was in 4th grade. And you can see the picture of me in the little blue outfit on top. That was the very first wool outfit that I created that I'll also show you here live in a little while. But as I was creating with wool, I was in 4th grade and my mom said, let's try sewing with this. And I learned a lot of foundational sewing skills that really began to expand my interest in working with more complex patterns and more complex fibers, such as learning how to insert buttonholes for the first time, learning how I press and work with more complex fabrics such as wool, how I insert linings into garments and why they're necessary, and how to hand sew in hems so that they're invisible and you don't see them. So all of those techniques allowed me to begin my wool journey, which then led me to participate in the Make It With Wool contest for the next 15 years. So I've competed for over 15 years in the contest, and in my off years when I was in college and I didn't compete, I also got to serve as a judge for the contest at our state level. So I've been able to stay involved. And I think the piece that I love most about Make It With Wool is not just the garment creation, which that is a passion of mine, but also the community that I've built through the contest. Many of you have been part of that community, mentoring me and helping me learn sewing techniques when working with wool. And from my very first year of competing in 4th grade, I made friendships that year that I have continued and maintained to this day. And I still compete with some of the folks that I competed with my very first year. So the community that has been built through that and the continued learning experiences through workshops that we have through the contest has also expanded my understanding of how I work with and create with wool. So I'd like to share with you a little bit more about that today. So what is Make It With Wool? Make It With Wool is a contest that highlights the beauty and the versatility and sustainability of wool as a natural fiber, as well as the fiber artists who use it. The objectives of this contest are to promote the beauty and versatility of wool, to show the creativity of fiber artists who are creating with it, whether that's through sewing, knitting, crocheting, weaving, spinning, and more, and to highlight the creative and technical skills of these artists. When you compete in the Make It With Wool contest, all garments that are made have to be at least 60% wool, so the fiber content has to be at least 60% wool. And we're judged on a few different criteria. First, 10% of our score is focused on marketability. Is the garment that you've made something that you might go to a store and say, hey, I want to buy that off of the rack? They also judge us on the presentation and appearance. So how does it fit your body style and the needs of your wardrobe? And it focuses on the quality of your construction. How is your garment made, and what techniques have you used to make sure that it fits your needs? So that was kind of an overview of the contest, and it's allowed me to develop a lot of technical skills that I'll share with you about. But before I start sharing more about that fiber arts journey, I want to just give you a brief overview of why wool in the first place. Why do we work with wool? Well, when we think about the current society that we live in and the ways that we produce and consume garments, most of the fashion that we have in our world is created through a linear model. And when I say that, that means that the majority of our products that we wear every day are made from synthetic, man-made fibers, such as polyesters, nylons, and acrylics. And those are made from non-renewable resources, oils, and things that are essentially plastics. And when they're produced, we call that a fast fashion process because they usually have a single lifespan. You buy it from the store, you wear it until it wears out, and then it gets thrown away. Oftentimes these garments aren't as easy to donate or they don't have as long of a lifespan. And we know that they also get washed a lot more frequently, just in the ways that we consume the things that we wear. When we wash any of these products, microplastics come from them and they can actually be released into our water streams and our systems that can create challenges for marine life. And when we dispose of garments after a single wear that are made out of synthetic fibers, they are put in the landfill, but because they are essentially a plastic, they then do not biodegrade, so they just sit there. On the other hand, wool is part of a circular supply chain. So natural fibers like wool and cotton are a little bit different. They begin by coming from the earth. Wool comes from sheep or goats or alpacas and llamas or even some rabbits. And when they're sheared, it grows back. It's continually regenerating. It doesn't require human intervention. And then when you take it from the sheep to create it into wool products, it's woven into a first life where your garment is made from the fiber, and these fibers have a lot of assets because wool is a protein-based fiber, meaning that it absorbs water very easily, so that if you sweat in your garment, it's not going to feel like you're wet and sticky in it, and it absorbs odor and locks it in so that your garment doesn't retain the scent of sweat, which makes you not have to wash it as often. So that's an asset of wool, but it's also then easily repairable because it's woven together instead of being just produced in like a flat fiber that doesn't have a weave to it. So that it then moves into the multiple lives of wool. Wool has a lifespan of 20 to 30 years generally. It's a much more durable fiber than synthetics, so that you can continue to reuse it. You've probably passed wool garments down from person to person and they can continue to be worn. Or if a piece of garment or a garment goes out of style, a lot of people can take that wool and restyle it into something else. And I'll tell you a little bit more about that today as well. And then when wool reaches the end of its life and you're no longer wearing it and the fibers can't be reused, if it gets thrown away, it's naturally biodegradable. So it releases carbon and nutrients back into soils as it biodegrades, doesn't remain in landfills, and continues then the circular process. So that is a little bit more about what I've learned about the sustainability of wool during my term as the National Make It With Wool Ambassador. And I think that's really sparked an interest in continuing to create with natural fibers. So, because wool and creating with wool is both an art and a science, the process of creating with wool begins with taking it from the sheep. And I want to give you just a quick rundown of how we get from sheep to the garments that I'm wearing today. Because it does go through a bit of a process. It starts with shearing your sheep so you have the fleece. Then you go through the scouring process, which is washing the wool, cleaning it, making sure it's free of any extra dirt or other fibers. And then it goes through the carding process. When it's carded, you're essentially taking the wool fibers and pulling them apart with two cones, and it helps align the fibers and straighten them out so that then you get something called wool roving. I'm going to show you this one because it's a little bit better example. But it's basically a long piece of wool that is all of the fibers just in a set. So it hasn't been spun into yarn or anything yet. From there, you can take this wool roving and then spin it into what we know of as yarn. And that can be used to knit, crochet, and make other things such as pot holders. You've probably seen knitted and crocheted bags before. People do sweaters all of the time. So there's many ways that you can then create with those yarn fibers. If you choose not to use this wool as a yarn, it can also be spun into extremely fine threads that are then used in weaving. And that's how we create wool fabric. So when the fibers are woven together and those thin lines have been put together, it creates the fabric that we think of. You might also see weaving, and this is a recent project that I just started on, that you can do to create mats, rugs, and other products as well. So not something I've experienced a lot, but something that I'm just starting to experiment with. When you think about weaving wool fabrics, those are done by industrial machines, but at home, folks that are fiber artists can also engage in the weaving process. I've also got a mat up here that has been woven with pieces of wool roving that you can come up and see later as well. So when we think about the many ways of working with wool, I just highlighted you can go through spinning, crocheting, weaving, and then when you have the fabrics, you can engage in a lot of creative things to do with them, such as wool applique. This is one that my mom created, so it's a bunch of wool pieces that have been sewn onto one another to create a wall hanging. If you came to the Phillies Christmas exhibit, you probably saw Patty Johnson's wool applique wall hanging that was cute red and white Christmas trees. So there's a lot of quilters that are creating with wool. And you can engage in sewing, and that is what my primary art form is transforming wool into garments that I'll show you today. So those are a few different processes. You can engage in dyeing wool at any point. So you can do it when it's in its roving state, when it's in a yarn state, when it's been woven into fabric, or even after you've created garments, you can dye it into the colors and the styles that you'd like. When I was in Ms. Beelman's communications class in high school, I actually got to give a demonstration speech about dyeing wool yarn, and I'd actually gotten some wool yarn and I learned how to dye it with, of all things, Kool-Aid. So lots of fun pathways to get to explore how to work with wool because it's a natural fiber. Those proteins in it absorb dye well, and so you can explore it in many ways. The pillow that I've got up here was actually a needlework project that has the wool dyed yarn as the woven fibers in it. So the last thing that I'm going to illustrate for you today in creating with wool besides sewing is the felting process. Wool felting is one way to create more of a craft form of woolworking. And you might be saying, okay, what is felting? You might have heard about felting if you've ever accidentally thrown a wool sweater into the washing machine. So, my aunt very kindly gave me an example of this. This is why we don't wash wool, because it felts very easily. This was originally a women's size large sweater. Now it's probably about a child's size large sweater. Because when you felt wool, it essentially goes through a process of being exposed to agitation, heat, and moisture. And when those three things combine, it opens up the proteins in the wool fibers that you can see right here, because wool fibers have scales on them, if you look at them at the microscopic level. Synthetic fibers and even some natural fibers like cotton do not have these scales. And when these scales are exposed to heat and moisture, they start to open up, and the agitation allows them to lock together and shrink down so that they fuse and cause felting to occur. Hence the reason that your sweaters shrink down a lot. So with that in mind, that is what allows the felting process to happen. Wet felting is one form of felting. It is exactly what happens when you put your sweater into the washing machine. But you can also do it more intentionally without having to put it in the washing machine. And I've learned about how to engage in wet felting with the support of some of my Make It With Wool community members. I'm going to go ahead and pass these around, but these are two wet felted scarves. I got to make this one, which you can see on screen, and this one was made for me. But I'm going to go ahead and pass those around as I share about the wet felting process. So feel free, you can kind of touch, feel what this is like. These began as wool roving. So when you're wet felting, you generally take wool roving pieces, and I'll kind of demonstrate right over here. You essentially will pull them off in small chunks of wool roving, about like this, and you lay them out in whatever design or length that you would like to create your product out of. You lay them out on top of bubble wrap, because this serves as your agitator when you're felting in the process. And once you've laid it out and just overlap small pieces of roving, as you can see in this picture right here, you make 3 or 4 layers cross-hatching them. So if one layer is all going this way, your next layer is going to go this way, and then this way and this way, because that allows more of the fibers to lock together. After you've laid out enough of your roving, and on all of these you can see I added some accent fibers as well, so some different colors to add some pizzazz to it. Then you spray it down with warm soapy water, adding in the moisture to your product. And then you roll it all up with a little bit of netting on top, and you begin the felting process. And essentially you are doing the agitation at this point, rolling it back and forth, kind of like a rolling pin. You get a really good forearm workout because you're doing that for about an hour to 2 hours of rolling back and forth and back and forth. You can't take breaks. fibers, absolutely. You want to check on it and make sure that those fibers are fused so that when you unroll it, you get the products that you see there. All of the fibers that were stacked up to about this thick have solidified into one piece. They've been felted together. You rinse it out, let it dry, and they're ready to wear. And they're some of the warmest, coziest scarves that I wear in the middle of winter. I love it. So that's the wet felting process. Some of you may have also seen wet felted things like wool dryer balls that you throw in your dryer in order to take static out of your dryer. I got to have a wool felted pot holder, so they're nice and secure, great for cooking with. But there's many, many other ways that you can create things out of wet felted items. The other form of felting that you can use is needle felting. And needle felting only focuses on the agitation piece. And this is what I've gotten to practice a little bit more and what you can come see in action tomorrow afternoon at the Philly if you would like to. We've got a great class of folks that are going to be felting away. I've gotten to facilitate a few different workshops on needle felting, and it's easier to do because you don't have to have all of the supplies that are required when you're doing wet felting and having all of the moisture and things to deal with too. So when you're needle felting, all you need is a wool felting needle, which has a pointed tip and then small barbs on the edges, which help with the agitation of the fibers and locking them together. Then you need your wool roving. It all begins with this piece of roving as well. And you can have those dyed in different colors. You'll have a piece of felting foam, which is essentially the backdrop that you're allowed to poke your needle into. And you'll want a background fabric. When you engage in the felting process, I'm going to kind of give you a quick sample here. You pick out your inspiration photo, whatever it might be. I often like using like landscape photos or flowers. And you pick out your background fabric. So this is just a simple piece of wool fabric. You put it on top of a piece of foam. It can be any foam that you have. And then I like to say that you look at your photo and you put it into layers. So you look, what's the back layer of this photo? What would be the middle layer? What's the top layer in terms of your details? And then you start with the back layer and stack up your wool roving as you continue to add layers to your image. So if my back layer required me to have maybe some white at the bottom and then light blue for the sky, I would take a small piece of wool roving, place it where I need it on my image, and then I just take my wool felting needle that looks like this, and I start piercing it right into my fabric. And as you do that, all of those fibers are going to lock into the fabric, and eventually, as you continue to poke it, it solidifies and flattens down so that you've got that piece added. And then you continue adding more and more fibers, stacking them on top of each other so that it felts it in. You then pull it off, and the back of yours looks like this. It's got some of those fibers that have stuck through, and essentially you're agitating the fiber enough to have the scales lock into the wool fabric and with one another so that it fuses and felts. A few projects I've got to create with felting are this cross, and so this was one that I made and felted out of wool. I've also gotten to create some just landscapes before, so there's one that was a silhouette of a windmill. I've done a couple of flowers as experiments, but there's many, many different types. You can come see some of my examples right up here. I also have to give a huge shout out because my workshops and opportunities to create wool felted items wouldn't have been possible without the help of the Treasures 3 Quilt Shop downtown, because they have helped me order all of my supplies. They have a great resource for wool roving that I can buy in many different colors. And so Sue and Karen have been huge assets in helping me get supplies to continue my love of felting also. So definitely give them a shout out if you can. Now, outside of wool felting, I'd like to focus in for the rest of our time today on thinking about wool as a sewing project and in garment form, because that's my primary form of creating. And as any good 4-H'er would say, you have to begin with the supplies. My very first 4-H demonstration was a show and tell on my sewing box. So today, if you'll humor me, I'd like to open up my sewing box for you and share what tools you need in order to create with wool well. When we think about it, the first tool that you need, obviously, is a sewing machine. And I created almost all of the wool garments that I'll share with you today on my mom's 1630 Bernina sewing machine. A nice heavy-duty metal parts sewing machine that was probably from, what, the 1970s?
No, this was 1997.
1997. The one before that was her Bernina sport machine, and that one was from a little bit before. So that was the a sewing machine that has seen quite literally my blood, sweat, and tears. It has celebrated with me when projects went well, and has cried with me when projects went wrong. And luckily, I got to inherit that sewing machine when my mom thought she needed to upgrade to a fancier one, and I said, I will gladly take your machine. So it now resides with me, and I get to continue working on it. Another thing that you need is a quality pattern. Many people ask, do you make your own patterns? I have learned how to. In my undergrad degree, I got to work for a temporary time in the K-State Theater costume shop where we did make our own patterns, but I don't make my own patterns generally when I'm sewing. I use pre-made patterns. The most common are Butterick, McCall's, Simplicity, Vogue, and you could buy them at Joann's, which is now going out of business, sadly, but you can still order them online. These are multi-size patterns, and I like to think about patterns as kind of like the puzzle pieces if your wool garment is the finished jigsaw puzzle. So you use these to cut out pieces of fabric, a yardage of fabric, and then you stitch those pieces together to create your garments. So many different patterns are usable. This is one that I used for a pair of pants that I made, and you're able to then continue building on those and adapting them over time based on your sizes and body needs. You also need a high quality iron when you're working with wool because as a natural fiber, wool doesn't necessarily like to lay in ways that it didn't naturally grow, a nice flat piece. So when I think about ironing, the first half of my wool career, I really used a normal home steam iron, like many of you probably have a Rowenta from Walmart. But I found that as I was working with that iron, that it didn't have even heat distribution and the steaming feature was not very consistent. Sometimes it would leak. And so I decided I was ready to upgrade. So my mom and I invested in a high quality steam iron that's more like one you might see at like a dry cleaner shop. If you want to come and feel it, it's got some weight to it. It's very heavy. But it also then hooks up at our home to a big tank of water. So it holds a gallon of water, and that allows for a gravity-fed steam iron to occur, and it provides an equal distribution of steam when I'm working with garments, and it has a higher heat ratio that you can control so that it provides a firmer press on your garments as well, so you get a nice crisp seam when you're pressing. When I think about pressing, I'll go ahead and use this as an example. The way that we often will work with this is by having, this is one wool garment that I've created, but essentially this iron you can take, and when I use it, it has a shoe on it, and this covers the heating element so that when I am pressing, it doesn't go directly against the wool. Because if you don't have a cover, or what is the next essential tool, a press cloth with a normal home iron, it can cause a sheen to form on your wool because it's actually beginning the felting process. So if you have just a normal home iron, using a press cloth and putting it between your wool fabric and the iron that you're using to press allows you to have a safer way to press your wool so that a sheen doesn't form, and so that you can distribute steam equally by spraying down your press cloth with water and allowing it to steam more evenly. So that's another essential tool that I often recommend to folks as well. Aside from my press cloth, another very valuable tool to have is a clapper. And most people are like, what is a clapper, Katie? It does quite literally what it sounds like it does. You use it to press your wool well by pressing your seam with your steam iron, giving it a good hard press. Then you take essentially a glorified 2x4 block of wood. This is a beautiful one that my dad wood burned for my mom and I. He is not taking orders right now. But once you give it a good press, you take this clapper and literally push it down on your seam so it has a good pressure and it helps get a crisper press on your wool. We do this and you say, well, why don't you just use your iron? If your iron's heavy, can't you press it down? Yes, but that would give the wool too much heat, and so this allows you to continue the pressure without the excess heat in your wool. So that's what a clapper is used for. And if you're working with really heavyweight wools, such as the one that you can come up and feel in my coat here, this wool fabric is coating and it's about 1/8 of an inch thick in a single layer, so getting a crisp press was really difficult. When you're pressing this, you don't just put it down on your wool, you literally clap it and you bang on your wool with the clapper in order to get it nice and flat. Anyone who thinks a sewing room is a quiet place has not been in the room when I am pressing wool garments, because you do truly have to sometimes pound your wool to get the fibers to lay as flat as you would like them. The other key tool that I use when pressing is a tailor's ham. It's not like your regular Easter ham. This is it's a piece of fabric that has been filled with sawdust inside. I actually made this tailor's ham when I was in 5th grade because it's useful, especially when working with more tailored garments, such as ones that fit with the curve of your body. So anything that has a curve when you're pressing darts, when you're pressing seams in pants, is useful to have a tailor's ham because you can slip it inside and it mimics the shape of your body. So you can form it to that so that when you press, it's pressing around a curve rather than pressing it flat on a table. So that just helps you get a more accurate and even press when you're working with your garments. You can also have hams that are skinny, and I often call these the sleeve hams. So this you can fit down inside of sleeves so that when you press it, if your sleeve is narrower than the base of your iron, you're not pressing extra creases into the sides of your sleeve. And the same way with narrow pants. So those are some of the pressing tools that you use when you're working with wool. You also often will use interfacing when you're sewing with wool garments. And this is essentially like a piece of fabric that you iron on to the inside of your garment to provide extra stability. I'm going to pass around a couple of different pieces of interfacing. The first one will be a Pellon interfacing, that's a polyester interfacing. The second is a horsehair. So I'll go ahead and give those to you so you can kind of feel them as two different types. The most common type we use is a Pellon interfacing. You can buy that at any fabric store. And you'll feel on one side of these that one side feels kind of bumpy. That's because these interfacings are fusible, meaning they have tiny glue dots on them that when you expose them to heat, melt down and it fuses to the fabric that you need to add stability to. When I'm sewing with wool, I most often use the horsehair interfacing, the one that looks like it has stripes in it, because it is literally made of natural fibers, horsehair, goat hair, or others. And it allows it, because it's a woven, to continue to have the added flexibility that's also in the woven fibers of wool. So those are most commonly the interfacings that I use to provide stability for my garments. And they also are used with the press cloths in order to make sure that they're nice and secure when attached to your garments. Then the last thing that is a really essential tool are your marking tools when you're working with wool, because on any pattern, it's going to have certain markings that tell you places where you need to start and stop sewing, places where you might need to attach buttons, places where you're inserting pockets, stopping zippers, and so on. And making sure that you can transfer those markings from your pattern to the actual wool that you're sewing on is essential. There's a whole host of different marking tools you can use that include chalk, wax pencils, vanishing pens, and more. I most often prefer to use what I like to call our mechanical chalk pencil. And so it's just like a mechanical pencil, but the lead in it is actually a fine-packed piece of chalk so that you can get really precise markings on your wool, and it just rubs off right after and when you're ready to finish your garment, so you don't have to worry about it. One that my mom and I have learned not to use is wax marking pencils on wool, because we actually experimented with this one, and it's supposed to be an iron-off, so the wax irons out of your fabric. And we found when we used it on one of the dresses that she was making me, it did not iron out. And so those are ones that we avoid. And then vanishing ink pens, such as friction pens, I use a lot on cotton sewing and other projects, but I don't use them on wool because I found I used a friction pen, which is a vanishing ink pen that is activated by heat, so you iron over it and the pen ink disappears. I had used that on this actually wool felted cross, and I had traced all of the little designs that you see that I felted onto the cross fabric so that I had kind of the outline to felt within. Well, when I finished felting and I went to iron over it to remove just those little edge marks, it didn't come out. So I had to do a lot of finagling to felt just a little bit further out to cover up some of the marks and using a gentle detergent to try and get some of them out. But I learned that's not a pen that I tend to use either. Some people like to use what are called tailor's tacks, which are basically taking a small stitch of thread through your fabric and then clipping the threads and leaving the tiny ends in as another way to mark your fabric. I don't often use that just because it takes a lot more time when marking. And sometimes if you're sewing really narrow seams, that thread can get caught and be really hard to pick out of your seam. But it is another valuable tool for complex tailoring too. And then probably the most important thing to have as a supply is your fabric types. And there are many, many different types of wool that you can explore. I've got a whole bunch right up here, so when I'm finished today, please come up, touch, feel, kind of explore all of the different types of wool that are here. You're also welcome to come and touch and feel any of my wool garments. But when you think about the many types of wool, the wool creation has really evolved over time. No longer is wool just that itchy, scratchy plaid that is made into a men's suit. We've really evolved, and so some of my favorite woolens now to work with are stretch merino wools. So this is 100% merino wool. It's a stretch knit that is washable at home. So I'm going to pass these around because most people are like, there's no way this is wool, and I absolutely love showing it because this is a really nice wool. It's been treated in its processing with a chemical that allows it to secure your wool fibers, so when you wash it at home, it doesn't end up felting. I use this a ton for athletic wear, and one of my favorite garments to get to wear is actually just this athletic shirt. It's made out of the same exact fabric, just in blue. And this is one that I love taking runs in and walks in because many athletic wear and hiking companies that you'll see have wool products because they wick away moisture and they help you retain heat as well. So they're great for when you're exercising. Plus, this is one that I've washed probably 4 or 5 times in my home washing machine. And I don't dry it, still don't want to dry it because that could activate some of the fibers, but another great way to continue using wool in many, many forms. So there are many different wools that you can use. Many people ask me, okay, where do you get your wool at? Most of the time, I say, well, I first go to the Buhler family stash because we've got way too much wool in our basement to be able to count from. But when I generally have to buy wool to match a project, I go online because there are very, very few fabric stores that actually carry wool as a product. Luckily, one just opened up in Kansas City called Legacy Fabrics, so that's been a huge win for our fiber arts community in the Northeast to get to patronize a local supplier who's getting very high quality wool as well. But generally, I go to places like Vogue Fabrics, Britex Fabrics, Be Black & Sons, or a place called The Fabric Store in New Zealand, where the merino wool comes from, and order them online. I always say order a swatch first because wool can be very expensive, anywhere from $20 a yard to $200 a yard. And so when you purchase that, you want to make sure you're getting what you need. And oftentimes you need to get a swatch so that you can match the colors and make sure the weight of your fabric is what you want for the project you're creating before you buy yards and yards and yards of it. Once you've gotten your wool, the other thing that I have always learned to do before sewing for the Make It With Wool contest is to test your wool. Because, as I said, you have to have at least a 60% fiber content when you're sewing for the contest. And I found that one garment that I created for the contest one year was this beautiful boucle coat. It's black and gray. I love this coat, and I made it with a purple dress underneath it. I ordered this wool from Mood Fabrics in New York City, and online it said it was 100% wool, so I got it, created my entire coat, showed up to the contest, and you have to send in swatches that they professionally test before the contest. And my state director came up to me and said, Katie, I'm so sorry, but you will only get to compete with your dress because your wool fabric didn't test out. This actually ended up being less than 60% wool in the test, even though it had been advertised as 100% wool. So, you only make that mistake once, and now I've learned how to test my wool at home. So, you actually can test wool in very simple ways when you're at home by cutting a small sliver of the wool, submersing it in fresh Clorox bleach, and if it dissolves within a couple hours to overnight, that protein fiber will break down, and if it completely dissolves, you know it's 100% wool. If it partially dissolves, but there's still stuff left, you know it's probably partially wool, and if it doesn't dissolve, it's not wool. So that's kind of become the at-home test that I perform to make sure that my wool fibers are truly wool when we're looking at them. So how do I use wool? Well, when I think about fabric and creating with it, one technical piece that you have to make sure you're paying attention to if you're working with plaid wool is matching plaids. So as I think about many of the projects that I've created, I have a lot that I've made out of plaid, and I always like to say you don't have to create out of plaid because that's kind of a stereotype of wool, but I truly do love working with plaids. So when you work with plaids, there's many ways that you have to match them, and the first phase of matching plaids actually happens before you even cut out your pattern. You have to match them with your fabric because generally when you make a pattern, you're going to have to cut out 2 sides. So you're going to need 2 pant legs, you're gonna need 2 fronts of your coat, and you do that by folding your wool in half. To match plaids, it's a very simple process. This is a plaid from a pair of pants that I made. You simply find a juncture in the plaid. So if that point was right here, you take a straight pin, poke it in through that juncture, right there, and then you flip it over to the opposite side and look, does it come through the same juncture point again? And then you just simply go through and adjust so you get it right through the same juncture point. And then you repeat the process, looking for that juncture. And does it come through on the top at that same juncture again? Yes, and you've matched a plaid. You continue that process for all of the yardage of plaid that you are cutting out. It is not a fast process. Matching plaids takes time, and it's definitely worth it when you're cutting out fabrics. After having matched plaids for this beautiful tartan coat on my college dorm bed, and for this lovely dress and coat on a shag carpet floor in my apartment in Wamego, I learned not to take for granted the giant ping pong table that we have in my basement at home that hasn't seen a game of ping pong in over 15 years. So that is a really valuable asset to have. When I think about the garments that I've made for matching plaids, there are lots of different ones that I've used. The first one is the outfit that I have on today. So I created this coat to go with this dress. And it was an interesting process of matching plaids because it, unlike most coats, doesn't have a symmetrical front. So because it's patchworked, I had to think about matching plaids, and I started with my back piece here. So this was the first piece that I created. Then when I was cutting it out, I had to figure out, okay, where is this piece going to line up so I make sure it looks like these plaids are going straight across and that they'll line up underneath the arm, and cutting it out accurately in that way. So that was one place that I had to consider matching plaids. You also have to do it when you're cutting out pants to make sure the front and the back align, so you're not only matching the fabric, but making sure your pattern pieces are lined up so that every line of your plaid also lines up when you sew the seam. So those were a couple of pieces that I've got on that I matched plaids with. You can also see on screen there this extra large plaid that I created into what I fondly call the atrocity of a coat that I made in high school. This lovely coat, I feel like I could say like, it's a bird, it's a plane, no, it's a wool coat. Oh my goodness, it was a saga. In hindsight 2020, this was not a good garment for me to make. I picked it out because I was like, wow, it's big, it's complex, this is like a prize-winning coat. What I didn't think about is the size and stature of my body does not hold a coat like this well. And so I did create this coat, and it has a plaid skirt on it. And thank goodness for Pat Brandt, Facts teacher at Skyline. She was a wonderful asset and helped me work through how to cut out the plaids on this coat because it's a circle skirt. It's almost 360 degrees around. And as I was creating it, it originally had many different panels. And as we think about the panels on it, it looked like this originally. So I cut them out, and I realized that because of the angles, the plaids would not match. So I had to recut it with only one seam, redesigning the entire pattern so that the plaids would match on it. So that's just another example of plaids in action. You can see many other examples of plaids, but one way that I have gotten to work with them that's kind of the workaround for plaid matching is to cut plaids on the bias, meaning at a diagonal. And those can be a neat accent feature, but it also prevents you from having to match them outwardly. So this is a yoke where I cut it on the bias. It does tend to stretch more, so you want to make sure that you interface it well, but that's an example of how you can avoid having to match some of your plaids. I also did this on the waistband of the pair of pants that I made for my nationals outfit this year because I had darts in the seams, so I knew that there was no way my plaids were going to match vertically, so I decided to cut it on the bias as well. So a couple of different examples of how we work with plaids there. Aside from working with plaids, you also want to consider buttonholes. That's another key technique that I learned about making. And the most common type of buttonhole that you put in is using your sewing machine. The ones that are just put in using a zigzag stitch on your machine. I learned how to do that very first on my first wool garment right here. It has machine sewn in buttonholes, and I think the most stressful part of this is not the sewing of the buttonhole, but of the cutting of the buttonhole. Because it's a very fine space, you need a nice sharp pair of scissors to slice through it, And I will still remember to this day when I cut my very first buttonhole open and I nicked one of the threads on the edge. And if you nick a thread, it runs the risk of pulling out the entire buttonhole. And so my mom gently helped me stitch down around the edge where I had nicked so that it wouldn't come loose. But that was a really valuable learning experience to get to have when I was sewing my machine buttonholes. I also have sewn in bound buttonholes. Bound buttonholes are what you see on the black picture up front. And I've got a couple of different examples of them. Probably the easiest to see is on this gray coat. The bound buttonholes are a little different. They're not put in by stitching back and forth on a machine. They're actually fabric that has been sewn in on the machine as well. And so bound buttonholes provide a little more of a finished look. It matches your garment and they're a little bit more invisible. You see these a lot more on very tailored garments or suits as well. So those are bound buttonholes that you can see an example of there. And I've got a couple of other examples right up front here as well. And then last, you can hand sew in buttonholes. And I actually got my first experience hand sewing buttonholes on the coat that I made for my nationals outfit this past year because, as I said before, the coating I used was extremely thick. So because it's a layer on facing and an outer shell, this was almost a 1/4 inch thick of fabric that I was working through. And there was no way my sewing machine was going to go through it for a bound buttonhole or for a sewn in buttonhole. So I said, okay, I'm gonna get a new learning experience in here. And I spent probably in total, I'd say 12 to 15 hours learning how to create the hand-sewn buttonhole and then inserting them into this garment. And I'll go ahead and pass around a couple of examples of the buttonhole stitch on this piece, and then a hand-sewn buttonhole that I've actually created in a smaller version, so you can kind of see what those look like. But as you think about hand-sewing buttonholes, it requires a few new supplies. I used beeswax and heavy-duty buttonhole thread because when you put beeswax on the thread and iron it, it provides it a little more stability and sturdiness so that as you're sewing around the edges and it's getting the pressure of having buttons rub against it, it doesn't fray out. I also learned about using actually a hole punch to punch out the small keyhole that was at the top of my button to allow that button to kind of sit and secure itself in it as well. So those were some hand-sewn buttonholes, and you're welcome to come up and see what they look like as well. Outside of buttonholes, I also have learned a lot more about linings. And blue garments can have two different main kinds of lining. There are bagged linings that you often see on suit coats or on heavier coats, and that is where your entire garment is encased with a lining. There's no openings to see inside of it. And so when I think about creating these, you generally make kind of two separate coats. You make the lining part of the coat, and you make the shell of the coat. And then you sandwich them together, right sides together, and sew around the entire edge, leaving a small opening generally at the hem somewhere that you reach into and pull your entire coat through to turn it inside out. The reason we bag linings is often in garments where we have shoulder pads, because then they can't be pulled loose and you don't see any of the inner seams. For other garments like pants or dresses or skirts, you have what's called a free hanging lining, and that is where the lining is not attached. So it is loose and you've got two separate hems in your garment. So you can see my wool hem as well as the lining hem. Generally you attach these linings just in small places using what are called tailor's tacks or swing tacks. And these are just small crocheted pieces of thread that attach your lining at key spots so that it doesn't pull out when you're taking it off and it doesn't get twisted inside of your garment as well. So those are all there in your garments too. I also had the opportunity to learn a lot about designing linings because there are a lot of patterns out there today that don't have linings in them. For example, this coat, I used a Jolie pattern. It's a French company, but I actually made the first version of this when I was in 5th grade. And I loved the coat so much that I decided I wanted to make it again last year. So same pattern, but both of them had no lining when I first began, and I knew I needed a lining for my heavy coats. So with the help of Pat Brandt, Pat Clausen, my mom, and lots of internet research, we redesigned and created our own lining patterns for both of these coats to be able to have the lining inside of them. And then the last thing that I'd like to hit on is the tailoring and restyling of garments, because ultimately when you're using patterns, you have to tailor them to fit your body style, because rarely do they fit exactly like the model that they were made off of. So when I think about tailoring, one garment that I did the most tailoring on was my wool pants that I used for my nationals outfit this year. These pants actually began by making a mock-up or a muslin of them, which is generally how you start making a pattern that you want to fit really well. And a muslin, if you want to hold those up, yeah. A muslin looks like this. It's quite literally made out of just a cotton fabric. And I made my first muslin of these and realized that when I made them, they fit fairly decently, but they had too much fabric here. They bunched a lot. And so I wanted to remove some of it. So through lots of YouTube searches, I found that in order to reduce the excess fabric in the waist area and hip area, I needed to take some of it out of the crotch seam. And I began to redesign and restyle. So I retraced my pattern, as you can see in that middle photo, onto doctor's table paper. It's the perfect weight for patterning. And then I began to adjust, and you can see the red dotted lines show where I was shifting the seam in order to take out some of the excess fabric. Then I recut it out of another muslin and tried the process again. I went through that process 3 times, so I have 3 different muslins that I made to get all of my adjustments accurate. On the last muslin I made, I finally had all of my waist fitting perfectly like I wanted, and I had it great, and I looked down and I realized in all of my adjustments, I had thrown off the grain line, meaning like that it hangs straight, so my leg was twisted halfway around, and I said, oh no! So for my final muslin, I redrafted it and got the grain line straight, and was able to finally make my pair of pants like I wanted. So it takes a lot of tailoring sometimes, in this case 4 different sample patterns before I made the final product. You also can think about wool in terms of restyling. I mentioned the cyclical process of wool production. And something I've really been excited about in the past year is learning how I can restyle old garments into new garments. You can see in the picture right up here, I actually took a wool skirt that we'd had a friend give to us that was made out of Scottish wool, probably from the 1950s or 60s. It was an ankle-length plaid skirt in a size 12, so really large. And I chose to say, okay, I love this fabric. I want to make a tote bag out of it, which you can see right there on screen. I've got a tote bag made out of it. So I started by cutting off the hem of the skirt, re-ironing it, giving it a good press, and cutting out the tote bag I wanted to make. And after I got the tote bag made, I looked at the leftover skirt and I said, I think there's enough there that I could probably make a skirt for me out of this. So I took the pre-made skirt and just took out part of the waistband, readjusted the pleats on the front, and I was able to take the leftovers where I had cut off for the bag to make a skirt for myself as well that you can see me wearing there, and I loved it and getting to interact with it and to share it as well. So that was just another way that you can restyle and reuse old garments, transforming them into new looks. And so that's what's kind of energizing me as I look towards my future in working with wool. I also got to restyle a wool sweater. I went to Costco over Christmas break and learned about how I can take a wool sweater that I've got here. Let's see. This started out as a men's extra large sweater. I purchased it, took it home, grabbed a pattern that I'd made before that I really liked the fit of for me for my shirt, and then I cut it out using the base of the men's sweater and the pattern that I enjoyed in order to restyle it to fit me. I also learned that you can take off the neckband of sweaters because it's sewn on with a single magic thread, as we call it. And when you find that thread and can pull it out, it unknits the entire band. So that's what this started as. There we go, same size except in black. And so I took off this entire neckband with the magic thread and then re-sewed that on, re-knitted it on at the end so that it would have a finished tailored look. So just another way that you can actually restyle wool garments into things that you enjoy and that you're used to. So as we think about all of these different forms of restyling, there's also many pathways forward. So as I think about what wool looks like in the 21st century, as we're all creating together, there are many ways that we can share our skills. I've gotten the opportunity to connect with sheep growers in Kansas, young producers in Kansas 4-H programs, young seamstresses in Kansas 4-H to share my passions. And one of the groups that I learned the most from is my fellow Make It With Wool contestants who continue to inspire me with the different garments that they're creating. Outside of my personal journey though, I also have seen wool emerging in our global sphere. the United States Olympic team, their garments were made from American-made wool, from the Shiniko Wool Company, who's a producer, a female-based producer who also has created and shared their wool with Make It With Wool contestants before. And zooming into an entirely other kind of field of working with wool, it's fascinating because a professor at K-State actually explored clean burial practices and social life practices and felted an entire coffin cover that is this picture up here that's completely biodegradable as well. So clearly the ways of working with wool are endless. I've just gotten to start exploring. And as I think about the question of what next, I'm excited to continue seeing how I can contribute to the reduction of fast fashion by recreating, restyling, and promoting the sustainability of wool in the garments that I create. So thank you all for being here today and for sharing some time with me. I know I didn't make quite as much time as I wanted for questions, but I would love to field any that you have now, and please come up, touch, feel, interact. I'm happy to tell you more about any of my garments. So thank you for being here. My ambassadorship, I actually made a 4-piece wool garment. So you can see 2 of the pieces here. This is out of that knit that I passed around, as well as the coat. And then I made this jacket and the pants that I had out here. There's the plaid pants. The plaid pants. So I made this 4-piece garment last fall in my duplex in Wamego. And all 4 of these I wore together. So you could have, on the very first slide, you probably saw the pants and the suit jacket and shirt on, and then I wore the coat over the top of it. I competed at the Kansas contest first and won the senior division there, and then I competed at the national contest. And at the national contest, there's representatives from about 30 or so states, and then there's an at-large contest. And I won at the national level. And so the winner at the national level gets to serve as the ambassador for the year. And we just recently passed my title on to Henry from Minnesota, and he made an absolutely beautiful wool garment this past year for the national contest. So it's been a joy to get to connect with all of them. So that was kind of my nationals winning outfit.
And it fit her beautifully.
Yes, I didn't want to have it on because I wanted to use it to show today. But yes, that was.
Can you compete in that again and maybe be an ambassador again?
So as I think about kind of the future, you can serve as the junior ambassador or the senior ambassador. And once you've won in your division, you can't compete again in the same division. But they do have an adult contest, and I happened to win in the senior division the last year that I could be in it, so I can compete again as an adult. And I probably will. I'm not sure quite when yet, but yes, I could serve as the then adult ambassador too.
How much traveling was involved?
So the ambassadorship is kind of what you make it. There's not a lot of funding for actual travel, so I did a lot of travel across Kansas in connecting with others, and that was my primary outreach, was just getting to visit many different 4-H groups, communities, fiber artists, in order to share and promote. And then we get to go to the national contest, which gloriously was in Scottsdale, Arizona in the middle of January, so I got a nice trip down there to enjoy and continue to support our fiber artists there. Yeah.
So you made things from llama wool?
I
or
haven't gotten to do a lot with
alpaca?
alpaca and llama wool. I've done a little bit of felting with some of their roving, but I haven't made any garments, I don't believe. No, out of any llama's wool yet, but it is on the radar for sure.
And what is cashmere wool?
Cashmere, it comes from the cashmere goat.
Okay.
So it is a goat actually fiber, and it is a very fine fiber. I have a cashmere sweater that I'm wearing. It's very warm and cozy. So yes. Yes, Jane.
This is a llama wool hat.
Oh, there we go. So we have an example right there of a felted llama's wool hat. And is that from?
Did you make that?
Yeah.
A friend of mine did.
There's
So
a
So perfect example there. Other questions?
Hey, do you get asked to do a custom work?
I get asked a lot. I have become the resident tailor of the Staley School of Leadership Studies because everyone knows, hey, Katie can hem my pants. I had a friend that was like, my zipper zipper's broken, can you put in a new zipper for me? So I do for select friends, I do not have a tailoring business, and so I take them selectively when I have time in my schedule that allows for it, but if people need actual tailored garments, I do not do custom sewing. I can put in hems, I can fix holes in things, I can occasionally replace a zipper, but I don't do extensive tailoring, so, yeah. Yes,
For other people.
for others, yes, except for myself right now.
Hey, are there any good like social media accounts to follow of people, you know, if there's just a couple names of ones if people want to investigate more about wool sustainability or anything like that?
So, first, National Make It With Wool has a Facebook page and an Instagram account that they frequently post on. We have a Kansas Make It With Wool Instagram account as well and Facebook page. And then if you look up, I think it's just American Woolens, they also have a really neat page that posts a lot about more of the sustainability of wool fibers and how wool fibers are grown that I love getting to connect with as well.
Okay, so he will be horrified, but he knows me well enough. I'm gonna tell you that I think your dad should walk around and show the best.
He has a
he's
Katie
got.
Buhler creation on
It's lying.
my dad's Christmas present. I didn't get quite done in time for Christmas. Also wool, also wool. I told my mom this morning, she's the only one that hasn't gotten a wool creation from me, so she's next on my list. Trying to figure out what she wants made out of wool next.
That, well, she did make the cross, that
Yeah,
was
the
our
felted cross, that was
Yeah, that was our
There was a mill, I'm not sure, I'm kinda out of touch. There used to be one at Phillipsburg, which
Yes.
is now gone, but I think there's still one at Rose Hill.
Oh, I haven't heard of that one.
Yeah,
Great.
Sue Deweese
Yes.
used to take her alpacas over there and have them sheared.
Yes.
And so it would be a wool source if they're still
In business,
in
right?
business.
I haven't looked into that one yet, but I know we've got a really kind of a thriving group of fiber artists up in the northeast part of the state, and it's been really interesting. I got to meet them at a little event called Fiber Flurry this past November, and there were many people who are just local wool growers that actually kind of do their own processing of wool and have it processed, and then they take the roving, and there were spinners, there were weavers. It was nice to get connected because now I have a new resource for getting kind of homegrown wool products as well. So very exciting. What other questions? Well, as you're headed out today, please come on up. Please feel, touch, explore. But thank you all.